My fiancée said her male best friend would always come first, so I let him have her. She said it like it was a settled fact, something she decided long before I ever entered the picture, the way you'd mention a childhood allergy. Tyler will always come first, that's just how it is. I remember nodding at the time like that was a reasonable thing to hear from the woman I'd just asked to marry me, still riding the adrenaline of the proposal itself, unwilling to let anything puncture the moment. It took me almost a year to understand what I'd actually agreed to that night. My name is Ryan. I'm 30 years old, I work as a financial analyst for a regional bank, and the trait people who know me would probably use to describe me is patience, not the passive kind, but the deliberate kind, the kind that comes from spending a career building models where you don't get to react to a single data point in isolation. You wait, you gather. You let a pattern show itself fully before you draw a conclusion from it, because acting on incomplete information is how you lose money and lose relationships in roughly the same way. Colleagues have teased me about it over the years, the way I'll sit on a hunch for weeks before raising it in a meeting, waiting until I have enough behind it that nobody can wave it away as a feeling. That patience is the only reason I lasted as long as I did with Amanda, and it's also, eventually, the thing that let me walk away clean instead of getting talked back into a life I'd already seen clearly for what it was. Amanda and I met through a mutual coworker at a work happy hour, and from the beginning, Tyler was part of the package. She mentioned him in our second conversation, her best friend since middle school, practically family, the kind of friendship people describe as platonic soulmates. I didn't think much of it. I've had close friends of my own my whole life, and I liked honestly that Amanda had that kind of loyalty in her. It read as a good sign about her character, not a warning sign about our future. Our first 6 months were by any measure good. Amanda was funny in a dry, understated way that took people a while to catch on to, and she was fiercely loyal to the people she loved, a trait I found genuinely attractive even as it would later become the exact thing that unraveled us. She worked as a physical therapist, good at her job in the way people who are naturally attentive to others tend to be good at that kind of work. We moved in together after 8 months, quickly by some standards, but it felt right at the time, natural, like we were simply formalizing something that had already been true for a while. Tyler helped us move boxes that weekend, cracking jokes the entire time, and I remember thinking, watching the two of them work in that easy, practiced rhythm old friends have, that I was lucky to be marrying into a life that already had good people in it. We dated for a year before I proposed, and in that year Tyler was a constant, steady presence, texts throughout the day, weekly dinners, an annual camping trip Amanda and Tyler had done together every summer since college that she made clear, gently but firmly, wasn't up for negotiation or my inclusion. I didn't push on that. It seemed like a small, sacred tradition, the kind every long friendship deserves to keep, and I told myself a man secure in his relationship doesn't need to be included in every corner of his partner's life. I want to be fair about how this started because I think it matters. In the beginning, none of it felt like betrayal, it felt like adjusting to someone else's established life, the way you do with any partner who had a full existence before you arrived in it. I told myself jealousy over platonic friendship was small and beneath me, and for a long time I believed that completely. Tyler wasn't secretive. He came to my birthday dinner 2 years running, brought a genuinely thoughtful gift both times, remembered small details about my life that even some of my closer friends forgot. He seemed on the surface like a genuinely good guy, funny, easygoing, the kind of friend who'd help you move apartments without being asked twice. I liked him honestly for most of that first year. We even developed our own rapport separate from Amanda, the kind of easy friendship two men sometimes build simply by being adjacent to the same woman's life long enough. It was only after the engagement that the shape of things started to look different to me. The night I proposed, we were at a restaurant Amanda had mentioned wanting to try months earlier, and everything about the moment felt right up until the conversation that followed the yes. And where between the champagne and the walk to the car, Amanda brought up Tyler unprompted. She wanted to make sure, she said, that I understood something clearly before we moved forward. She said Tyler would always be a priority in her life, that their friendship predated me and would outlast whatever came next for either of us romantically, and that she needed me to be at peace with that as a permanent condition of our marriage, not something up for renegotiation later. I said in the moment that of course I understood that I'd never ask her to give up a friendship that mattered to her. What I didn't fully register, standing there on the happiest night of our relationship, was the specific phrase she'd used, "come first," and what that phrase might actually mean once it collided with the ordinary demands of a marriage. The first real test came about 4 months into our engagement, when my grandfather passed away unexpectedly. He'd been the closest thing I had to a second father growing up, and losing him hit harder than I'd expected any death to hit, even one everyone in the family had quietly braced for given his age and failing health that year. I called Amanda from the hospital parking lot, and she was there within the hour, which I remember being grateful for at the time, sitting with me in near silence while I tried to process what had just happened. But 2 days later, the night before the funeral, Tyler called her in what he described as a personal crisis. A breakup, as it turned out, nothing life-threatening, nothing that couldn't have waited a day, and Amanda left our apartment at 11 at night to go sit with him, leaving me alone the night before I buried my grandfather. When I brought it up the next morning, hollowed out and exhausted, she told me I was being insensitive to what Tyler was going through, that emotional crises don't operate on convenient timelines, and that she'd assumed I'd understand given how close Tyler and I had supposedly become ourselves. I let it go. I told myself grief was making me unreasonable, that I was looking for something to be angry at because I couldn't be angry at the actual loss. That pattern repeated itself in smaller and larger forms over the following 8 months, and I started, without fully admitting it to myself, keeping a mental tally. Tyler's promotion celebration took priority over dinner with my parents that had been on the calendar for 3 weeks. Tyler's dog surgery took priority over helping me pick out wedding invitations, a task Amanda had specifically asked to do together and then abandoned twice for Tyler-related reasons. Tyler's opinion on our wedding venue carried more weight in the final decision than my own stated preference, because Amanda said she trusted his eye more than mine, a sentence that landed harder than she probably meant it to. There was a weekend around month 6 of the engagement when my company sent me to a 2-day conference in Chicago, my first real shot at visibility with senior leadership, and I'd asked Amanda weeks earlier if she'd come along for the second night, since the company was covering a nice hotel and I wanted to celebrate afterward. She'd said yes enthusiastically, and I'd booked her flight. 4 days before the trip, Tyler's father had a minor cardiac scare. He ended up fine, released from the hospital within a day, and Amanda cancelled her flight to stay local just in case, even after it was clear Tyler's father was going to be okay. I flew to Chicago alone, gave my presentation alone, and celebrated a genuinely good professional moment by myself in a hotel bar. Texting Amanda updates she responded to sporadically, sandwiched between what she described as just checking in on the Reynolds family. I told myself again that I understood. Family emergencies don't wait for convenient timing. It didn't occur to me until much later to ask why Tyler's family had somehow become my family's emergency too. None of these things, taken individually, would sound like much to an outsider. That's exactly what made them so hard to push back on. Each one had a reasonable-sounding justification attached, and objecting to any single instance made me look petty, insecure, threatened by a friendship I'd promised to respect. I started feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in my own engagement, like a secondary character in a story that was actually about 2 other people. I couldn't say that to Amanda without triggering the same conversation we'd already had a dozen times, the one where she reminded me of the promise I'd made on the night I proposed, the one where I became the villain for questioning a friendship instead of a man raising a reasonable concern about his own marriage. And I couldn't say it to most of my friends either, because the few times I tried early on, I got some version of "that sounds normal, my sister has a guy friend like that too," which wasn't wrong exactly, but also wasn't capturing what I was actually trying to describe, not the existence of the friendship, but its explicit stated priority over me, spoken out loud, agreed to as a condition rather than emerging as a natural balance 2 people find on their own. I brought it up once with a coworker, Josh, someone I trusted enough at the time, over lunch, trying to describe the Chicago trip without making it sound as bad as it had felt living through it. Josh's response was well-meaning but useless. He said every couple has stuff like this, that I should pick my battles, that being the guy who complains about his fiancée's best friend is a bad look regardless of the specifics. I remember leaving that lunch feeling worse than before I'd brought it up, not because Josh was wrong to be cautious, but because I could feel myself starting to doubt whether what I was experiencing was even describable to someone who hadn't lived inside it. That's a particular kind of loneliness, not just feeling secondary in your own relationship, but feeling like you don't have the vocabulary to make anyone else understand why it matters as much as it does. My sister Emily was the one person who eventually understood, mostly because she'd watched enough of it happen in person over holidays and family dinners to see the pattern without me having to argue her into it. She noticed, before I said anything directly, that Amanda would often check her phone specifically after Tyler's name popped up, in a way that felt different from how she handled texts from anyone else, myself included. Emily asked me once, carefully over coffee, whether I'd ever really sat with what always come first, meant as a stated condition of a marriage, rather than as the normal ebb and flow every couple has around old friendships. I hadn't, not really. I'd absorbed it as a boundary I needed to respect, not as a hierarchy I was quietly being asked to accept as permanent. She pointed out something I hadn't considered, that healthy friendships, even close ones, don't usually need to be declared in advance as permanently outranking a future spouse. People who trust that a friendship will naturally find its place in a new relationship don't feel the need to make it a condition, spoken aloud on the night of a proposal. The fact that Amanda had felt the need to say it explicitly, before I'd even asked a single question about Tyler, suggested she already anticipated the tension and had decided in advance which way she intended to resolve it every time. Once Emily named it, I stopped explaining away the pattern and started actually paying attention to it as a pattern, the way I'd approach any dataset that kept producing the same anomaly across different conditions. I began noticing details I'd previously let slide past me, how Amanda's tone shifted warmer and more animated the moment Tyler's name came up in conversation compared to the flatter, more administrative tone she used discussing our actual wedding logistics, how she remembered small details about Tyler's work stress, his dating life, his moods, with a precision she rarely applied to details I'd mentioned about my own job or family. How on the rare occasions Tyler was upset with her about something, she'd spend days anxious and apologetic until it resolved, in a way she never did when something was unresolved between the two of us. I noticed, too, the specific asymmetry in how she talked about the two relationships to other people. At her cousin's baby shower, I overheard her describing Tyler to a distant relative as basically my other half, a phrase she'd never once used about me in 2 years, not even at our own engagement party. When her coworkers asked how wedding planning was going, she'd often pivot within a sentence or two into an anecdote about something Tyler had said or done, as if he were a co-author of the wedding rather than a guest at it. None of it was said maliciously, I don't think. I don't believe Amanda ever sat down and decided to build a hierarchy with Tyler at the top of it. I think it had simply calcified over a decade of being each other's primary person, long before I arrived, and neither of them had ever had to examine what would happen when a third person's needs were supposed to start outranking it. I started keeping a private log, not because I suspected anything physical was happening between them. I genuinely didn't believe that was the core issue, and to this day I still don't think it was, not literally, but because I needed to see laid out plainly whether the emotional architecture of our relationship matched the promises Amanda had made me about our marriage being the primary one. 2 months of entries told me what I already suspected. In the 17 weeks I tracked, Tyler's needs had visibly reshaped our plans on 11 of them. My needs had reshaped plans involving Tyler exactly 0 times because I'd learned without meaning to not to ask. I went back further too once I started actually looking, pulling up old text threads with Amanda from the months leading up to the engagement, rereading conversations I'd absorbed at the time without really examining them. I found a message from early in our dating, nearly 2 years old, where she'd told a friend, in a group chat she must have forgotten I could see on her open laptop one evening, that she'd already warned whoever she ended up with that Tyler wasn't negotiable, like it was a clause she'd rehearsed delivering long before she ever met me specifically. It wasn't new information exactly, she'd told me the same thing herself the night I proposed. But seeing it in her own words, addressed to someone else, months before I existed in the picture at all, made something click into place that a private conversation between the two of us never quite had. This wasn't a boundary she'd developed in response to me. It was a fixed condition she'd been offering to whoever came next, regardless of who that turned out to be. The moment that finally moved me from quiet observation into decisive action came about 10 weeks before our scheduled wedding date. Amanda had asked me to be understanding about something specific. Tyler was going through what she called a rough patch after his breakup, and she wanted to invite him to move in with us temporarily into the guest room of the house we'd just signed a lease on together, for what she described as just a few weeks while he got back on his feet. She framed it, as she framed everything involving Tyler, as a small, reasonable ask that only a controlling partner would object to. I told her I needed a night to think about it, which was true, but it was also the moment I finally let myself fully see the shape of what our marriage would actually look like if I said yes, not a wedding vow being tested by an old friendship, but a permanent third presence in our home, explicitly prioritized over me by written and spoken agreement, indefinitely. I didn't confront her that night. I've learned from the 8 months prior that confronting Amanda directly without preparation just handed her the emotional high ground and turned me once again into the unreasonable one. So I spent the next several weeks doing exactly what I do professionally when I need to make a decision I can defend. I gathered everything. I pulled up the shared calendar we used for wedding planning and quietly documented every instance over the past year where a Tyler-related request had overridden a planned commitment between us, dates and specifics, not vague impressions. I saved several text exchanges where Amanda had explicitly reaffirmed the Tyler comes first framing, including one from just 3 weeks earlier where she'd written, almost casually, that she didn't expect me to ever fully understand their bond and that she wasn't going to keep justifying it to me. I also spent time in those weeks sitting with a question I hadn't let myself ask directly before, whether I actually wanted a version of this marriage that worked, if Amanda had been willing to genuinely renegotiate the terms, or whether the pattern had already gone on long enough that no renegotiation would have changed anything real. I landed eventually on the second answer. It wasn't really about Tyler specifically, I realized, somewhere around week 2 of building my case. It was about the fact that Amanda had never once, in 2 years, treated the arrangement as something we were figuring out together. She'd treated it as a fixed term I'd already agreed to, and every time I raised a concern, she responded not by adjusting anything, but by reminding me of my own consent to a condition I'd barely understood the weight of when I gave it. I talked to Emily at length, and I talked for the first time to my mother, who listened to the full pattern laid out in order and asked one question that stuck with me. Ryan, has she ever once put you first, or has she just asked you to accept never being first? I didn't have a good answer. My mother, who'd been married to my father for 34 years by then, told me something else that stayed with me longer than I expected it to, that every long marriage requires some version of coming second sometimes, to a job, to a parent, to a crisis, but that it's supposed to move in both directions over time, a kind of trade neither person keeps score of because it evens out. What I was describing, she said, didn't sound like marriage. It sounded like a permanent arrangement I'd agreed to without ever getting to renegotiate the terms. I decided the wedding shower Amanda's mother was hosting in 3 weeks, a gathering of both families, close friends, everyone who'd be at the actual wedding in 2 months, was where I needed to say what I'd finally understood clearly enough to say. I'd thought about other venues for this conversation too, a quiet dinner just the two of us, a sit-down with her parents alone, but each option had the same flaw. It left room for the story to get rewritten after the fact in private before anyone else had a chance to hear it plainly. Not because I wanted a scene and not out of any desire to humiliate Amanda in front of people who loved her. It was strategic, the same way any hard decision I make is strategic. I knew that if I raised this privately at home, I'd get the same reframing I'd gotten for 8 months running, the tears, the accusations of jealousy, the reminder of my supposed promise on the night I proposed. I needed a setting where I could lay out the actual pattern clearly to people who loved Amanda and who I trusted to see it honestly once it was in front of them, rather than filtered through her explanation of it after the fact. I didn't bring printed pages to a bridal shower that felt like the wrong tone for the room, and honestly I didn't need them by that point, because I'd rehearsed the pattern enough times in my own head that I could lay it out clearly without notes. During the toasts, when the room went around sharing what they loved about Amanda and me as a couple, I asked to say something too, and I kept my voice steady the way I'd keep it steady presenting a lone committee with an uncomfortable risk assessment. I started by saying I loved Amanda, and that I wanted the room to know that before I said anything else, because what came next wasn't easy to say and I didn't want it mistaken for something it wasn't. I said I'd spent the past year trying to be the kind of partner who respects an old friendship rather than competing with it, and I walked through it in order: the hospital parking lot the night before my grandfather's funeral, the Chicago conference I flew to alone, the wedding invitations abandoned twice, the venue decision that went to Tyler's judgment over mine, and now most recently the request that Tyler move into the home we hadn't even finished unpacking yet. I said that somewhere along the way, respecting Tyler's place in her life had turned into accepting that I would never actually be the priority in my own marriage, not during a family emergency, not during wedding planning, not even in our own future home, which she just asked me to share indefinitely with him. I said I couldn't marry someone who'd been honest from night one, that this was the permanent shape of things, and that I finally believed her. My voice caught once on the sentence about my grandfather, and I let it, because I wasn't trying to perform composure I didn't feel. I was trying to tell the truth as clearly and completely as I'd finally managed to see it myself. The room did not stay quiet the way I expected it to. Amanda's mother, who I later learned had voiced her own private concerns about the friendship years earlier, only to be waved off by Amanda every time, spoke up almost immediately, saying she'd wondered for a long time whether this exact conversation would ever happen, and that she wished it had happened sooner, for both our sakes. Amanda's aunt, less diplomatically, asked outright whether Tyler had been invited to the wedding as a guest or effectively as a groomsman, a question that had apparently been debated within the family for weeks without Amanda knowing. Amanda, for her part, didn't erupt the way I'd braced for. She went quiet in a way that felt, in hindsight, like something in her had known this reckoning was coming for a while and had simply been hoping it never would. The aftermath unfolded slowly rather than explosively. Amanda called off the wedding herself 3 days later, though I'd already told her I couldn't move forward before she said it. What surprised me more was learning over the following weeks that several people in her life, her mother, 2 of her closest college friends, even Tyler's own sister whom I'd met exactly once, had quietly held versions of the same concern for years and never said anything, assuming it wasn't their place, or assuming Amanda would eventually find her own way to a healthier balance without anyone forcing the conversation. Amanda's college roommate, a woman named Priya who I'd always liked, reached out to me a few weeks later, not to take sides exactly, but to tell me something that reframed the whole thing again for me: that Amanda's previous serious relationship before me had ended for almost identical reasons, a boyfriend of nearly 3 years who'd apparently reached the same breaking point over Tyler that I eventually had. I hadn't known that. Amanda had mentioned that relationship exactly once in vague terms, describing it as just not the right timing. Priya's version was more specific. He'd asked her more than once to set some kind of boundary around the friendship, and when she wouldn't, he eventually left, and Amanda had spent months afterward telling anyone who'd listen that he'd simply been threatened by a close female friendship of hers reversed, that he couldn't handle her having any male friend at all. Priya said she'd never fully believed that framing even at the time, and hearing my version of events years later confirmed what she'd quietly suspected. Tyler, for his part, reached out to me once, awkwardly a few weeks after everything came apart, to say he'd never meant to come between us, which I believed mostly, even as I recognized that intention and impact aren't the same thing, and that he'd never once in 2 years said no to being prioritized the way Amanda kept offering to prioritize him. I told him I didn't blame him specifically, which was mostly true. He hadn't built the hierarchy. He just never once questioned his place at the top of it, and given how comfortable that position clearly was, I couldn't fault him much for not volunteering to give it up. Emily told me later that Amanda tried for a while to tell a version of the breakup where I'd blindsided her with an ultimatum out of nowhere, jealous and controlling, unable to accept a woman having close male friends. It didn't hold for long, mostly because too many people in her own life had already quietly agreed with the actual pattern once it was said out loud in that room, and there were too many specific dated instances for a vague accusation of jealousy to explain away. I didn't fight the narrative directly. I didn't need to. The instances spoke for themselves to anyone who'd actually watched the past 2 years unfold. It's been 6 months since that shower. I moved out of the house we'd leased together within 2 weeks, breaking the lease early, taking the financial hit without much complaint because I wanted nothing left connecting me to that address. Still work the same job, still build the same kind of patient, evidence-based cases I've always built, but I notice now more than I used to when I'm in a new relationship. I'm seeing someone now casually, a woman named Claire from my apartment building, how differently it feels to be with someone whose actions and stated priorities actually line up with each other. Claire has close friends of her own, including men, and it's never once felt like a hierarchy I was being asked. It just feels like a normal, healthy life, the kind I spent 2 years being told I was unreasonable for wanting. I think about the wedding invitations sometimes, still sitting somewhere in a storage unit I've been meaning to clean out, the ones Amanda and I picked out together mostly by myself after she'd cancelled twice. I never sent the deposit back to the printer in time and ended up eating the cost, $400 for cardstock that never got used. It's a small loss compared to everything else, but it's the one that occasionally still catches me off guard, a physical object that exists because of a future that never happened. I kept one sample invitation not for any sentimental reason exactly, but as a reminder of how easy it had been for 2 years to mistake a fixed condition for a small, generous accommodation, simply because I loved the person asking me to accept it. My mother asks me sometimes if I regret waiting as long as I did to say something, whether 8 months of quiet observation was longer than it needed to be. I tell her no. I tell her that if I'd said something after the first incident at the hospital, grieving and raw, it would have been dismissed as exactly what Amanda always framed it, as an emotional overreaction, not a pattern. I needed the full shape of it, laid out clearly enough that even the people who loved her most couldn't argue their way around it. That's the only kind of truth that actually holds. Everything else just gets explained away, one reasonable-sounding excuse at a time, until you wake up one day and realize you agreed, a long time ago, to spend the rest of your life coming second in your own marriage. I still have Emily's question from that coffee shop conversation echoing sometimes, the one that first cracked the pattern open for me, whether Amanda had ever put me first, or just asked me to accept never being first. It's a distinction I find myself applying to other parts of my life now too, not just relationships, a small but permanent shift in how closely I look at the gap between what someone tells me and what their actual choices over time prove to be true.